Do you struggle with paint opacity? Do your colors look bright and vivid while the painting is wet, but then get a little dim as it dries? Welcome back, guys. It's G, and today we're talking about paint opacity. Opacity is a term that's used to describe the transparency of paint. It's sort of like the difference between looking at a solid wall and a sheet of glass. Opacity is usually denoted on the cube with one of these symbols, and from right to left that goes opaque, semi-opaque, semi-transparent, and transparent. So what I'm going to show you today, using a little bit of video editing, is how colors behave when they're opaque versus semi-opaque versus transparent or semi-transparent, and how that is affected by a light background or a dark background. And if you hang out with us until the end, I'll also talk to you about which techniques call for which sort of transparency of paint. So what exactly is opacity? Well, you can think about opacity as the transparency of a color, right? So if I use my little opacity slider right here, we can change this blue little block from fully opaque to semi-opaque, semi-transparent, and fully transparent. But the thing is, when we say paint is transparent, we don't actually mean it's fully transparent and see-through like glass. It's actually more like this. So if we were to stack them next to each other, it would look like this. This is all the same shade of ultramarine blue, just at different transparencies. Notice how the color starts to lose some of its saturation or chroma with the transparency. So next we're going to talk about what happens when you layer a transparent color over another color. So if you've ever done a pour with bright colors on a black background, you've probably had this happen to you before. So these 4 squares of pink are the 4 different opacities. From right to left, opaque, semi-opaque, semi-transparent, and transparent. And as we simulate the drying, notice how the color completely fades and gets really dark. And this is in addition to the fact that acrylic paints generally darken as they dry and set. So you might be asking yourself at this point, why do we bother with transparent paints at all? It's important to remember that acrylic paints were made in response to several issues that were present in oil paints. Namely, that oil paints took a very long time to dry, and oil paints were expensive, and their thinners used harmful materials that were bad for your health. Now, with that being said, the one thing acrylic paint does not do better than oil paint is blending, because acrylic paint, because it was made to dry faster, does not give you a very long working time. If you don't know exactly what you're doing and what sort of blending you want to do within a 5-minute window, you will most likely have to wait for a layer to dry and then go over it. Thing is, when you go over it, you don't reactivate the paint like you would with gouache, because acrylic paint is permanent. So the response to that was using transparent pigments or semi-transparent pigments or even semi-opaque pigments. The idea being that rather than blend and have paint reactivated when you go over it again with whatever medium you were using, turpentine, linseed oil, whatever it may be, with acrylic paints you can just use a semi-transparent or transparent paint and you will see both colors. So I'll repeat the experiment I showed you with the pink and black, only this time we'll use pink and ultramarine blue, and we'll see how that impacts the color that you see. So what we're doing here is essentially simulating how you would use transparent paints and opaque paints with a brush. So if we were to set down the 4 squares of pink from right to left, most opaque to most transparent, and then simulate the drying, this is what happens if you were to apply these paints with a brush. If you apply an opaque paint over another opaque paint that has already dried, it's just going to block it out completely. No amount of wetting the paint is going to actually get them to blend. And that's why we have transparent paints in traditional acrylic painting. So now that we've talked about opacity or transparency in terms of how they're affected by a light or dark background and how they're used for blending in traditional applications, as in with a brush, now we should talk about how we actually implement this in acrylic pouring. Now, truth be told, most acrylic pouring techniques are actually best done with opaque to semi-opaque paints. That is because, first of all, when you add tube paint to a medium, it will immediately lose some transparency. When you think of techniques like the ring pour, a straight pour, a ribbon pour, most of them where you don't apply any more force beyond putting the paint on the canvas do not require any transparency. Anything with nice, crisp, clear lines usually requires opaque paint. The only cases I can actually think of where I want to use transparent paints is when I'm doing the bloom technique and we blow on the paints to reveal the layers underneath. Generally, as a rule of thumb, you do not want to put opaque paints on top of transparent paints because you won't be able to see the transparent paint. Opaque paint doesn't reveal anything below it. But the one situation where I would do the exact opposite of that is in the bloom technique, where I personally prefer to stack them up from most transparent to most opaque. But part of the technique is also reducing the amount of paint and you spread it out by blowing. So what you end up with is this beautiful gradient of all the colors. In any other situation, I would tell you always put the transparent paints at the very top, not at the very bottom. And also as another rule of thumb, if you put transparent paints on top of paints that are darker than them, you will most likely not see them. In acrylic pouring especially, it's best to use transparent paints on top of light backgrounds. Otherwise, the darker backgrounds will swallow all the color. So to recap, transparent paints will fade significantly over a dark background. It's better to use it over a light background. Number two, transparent paints were made for blending, which acrylic paints lack versus oil paints. They're best used in traditional applications as a wash over another color that has already dried. Number three, most techniques in acrylic pouring are best done with opaque to semi-opaque paints. There are applications for semi-transparent, but you want to know beforehand that your paint is semi-transparent, and I'll quickly show you the test to figure out if your paint, which transparency your paint is, even if it doesn't say so on the tube. So this one's actually very simple. You draw down a opaque black line, and then you use your paints after the black line has set, go over the white and the black. What you're looking for from an opaque paint is that it looks exactly the same over the white as over the black. You should see no color difference in the new paint. And then as you go down to transparent, you should see more of the black line revealed when the paint is dry. I hope you found that explanation useful. This was my guide on paint opacity. If you're looking to learn acrylic pouring and want some useful links, I would go to this video to find out what supplies you need to buy, this video for how to mix your paint, this video for 3 easy techniques on how to varnish, and this video for the acrylic pouring terminology. Thanks for watching, guys.